Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Fula Kamara. Today we're in chapter 40, Troubleshooting Issues with Common Workflows. Sometimes clients don't follow the appropriate accounting workflow or understand the right terminology used in QuickBooks Online, which can lead to mistakes. This results in incorrect financial data and numbers that don't balance when you try to reconcile them. The common issues include misposted checks. The client may receive a check from their customer as a prepayment deposit for a future job. To record the deposit, they may select plus new and then select check. So the problem with this is the client inadvertently creates a vendor instead of a customer and assign the fees to expenses. This action decreases the balance in the bank account and also increases the amount of expenses in the profit and loss, thinking that they've created a customer when in other words they have actually created a vendor. So in this case, they selected advertising or promotional, for example, and enter the amount. Then they save. So once they've saved the transaction, now let's go to the journal, the recent transaction. Let's look for the transaction. So this is it. So now let's go to the journal and see what the double entry is, because they have received the check for a prepayment, but what they've done is they've recorded that prepayment thinking that they've recorded the prepayment, but they use the check workflow to record the amount, which is not the correct workflow. So if we go to the transaction journal, this transaction journal here will show the debit and credit. So now you see what they've done is they've debited the advertising expenses and credited the cash. So in that case, they've understated the cash balance by 200 and increased the expenses, which will reduce the profit in the profit and loss account. So that's the problem. So the solution, as a pro advisor, you should help your clients by pointing out that all transactions in the plus new menu are sorted by entity type. So you can see they have customers, vendors, employees. So by keeping this in mind, the client will be able to know where to record a specific transaction. So if it relates to a customer, they can go to the customer column and record receive payment instead of check. So they should have just select receive payment rather than selecting check. So if it relates to a vendor, they can use the vendor column and the vendor workflow. If it relates to employees, they can use the employee workflow. Then you also have the order, which is for other entries like journal entries or bank deposits. So that's the solution to that problem. Then sometimes also clients may record transaction via the bank register. Sometimes clients may use different financial software before they switch to QuickBooks Online. So they may be accustomed to entering checks and deposits from the bank register. Out of a habit, the clients may navigate to the transactions, because previously we have accounting, but now you can go to transaction and then you go to the chart of account and select view register. So sometimes client may be tempted to use the register to record transactions instead of using the proper workflow. So even though the client recorded a payment received using the bank register, QuickBooks Online doesn't recognize the liability as being paid, because if you record the transaction here, QuickBooks will only reflect the one entry but will not reflect the other entry. So the transaction will still show as a liability. That is, the liability will still remain. So the liability won't be recorded in that case. So the solution for this is clients who use the sales tax center must record all payments from it for them to be applied appropriately to the sales tax liability account. Like for example, if they are paying their sales tax, they should use the sales tax center. to make the payment, to record the payment. Okay, then the other area also, the account payable workflow. A client is struggling to understand the account payable workflow. They've been entering bills to record expenses, but they use the check screen to create payments to vendors. Let's say a client recording bills instead of expense. So what's the difference between a bill and an expense? Bills are for payables. That is, you receive the services or items to be paid for later. Okay? Whereas expenses are for services or items that are paid for on the spot. So if you paid for something outright, it means it's an expense. Whereas for bill, you haven't paid for them, but you've already received the services. For example, for your utility bills, for light bills. So you do receive your light bill at the end of every month because you haven't paid for it. Okay, whereas for expense, you've already paid on the spot at the time of receiving the service. So that's the difference in QuickBooks Online. So let's say the client record expense as bill. So in order for you to understand what the issue is, I would record two different transactions and then look at the double entry that each of them applies. So let's say, for example, when they pay $200 for stationery to a vendor, instead of recording expense, they record bill. So what they've done is they go and add this vendor and enter everything here. Let's say for advertising, for example. Let's just use advertising in this case because I don't want to create another account. So let's say the amount is $300. So in this case, they have recorded this instead of expense, because if they have recorded an expense, the double entry would have been different. So let's see, because they've used bill instead of expense, let's see the double entry. Because if they pay to a vendor using cash, so what they should have done is they record the expense and credit cash, right? But in this case, what they've done is they record a bill. So let's see the double entry because they've already paid for this. So you see the double entry showed that they have recorded a liability. They credited the account payable $3,000 and then debited the expense. So you see now they've recorded the liability. Even though the expense was correctly recorded, but they have created a liability in QuickBooks Online. So let's look at the entry that they should have recorded. When they pay for the advertising, that is, they pay on the spot. So what they should have done is, so they should have just recorded the expenses by crediting the cash and debit expense. So no liability would have been recorded. So let's see. If we click more and then transaction, the journal entry here should be a credit to the checking account and a debit to the advertising. This should have been the correct entry. So the proper workflow whenever the client has like bills is to first create a bill. So when they create a bill and then later they go and pay the bill, so it becomes an expense. So if they have a bill from a customer, then they should record a bill. But if they pay for the product or service outright or on the spot, they should use the expense instead of the bill. Because if they use bill, meaning they will create a liability instead of debiting the expense and crediting the cash that they have already paid, they are double counting. So the correct workflow, if they have a bill, they should create a bill first, and then once they make payment for that bill, then they should pay bills. So in QuickBooks Online, we have tools that will help us to identify issues. So in the accountant, like for the Pro Advisor, you have the accountant tools. These accountant tools, you can see that you have the voided or deleted transaction. So this voided or deleted transaction available only to QuickBooks Online accountant users. This helps you spot any transactions that a client may have deleted or voided, whether accidentally or on purpose. The tool is a filtered version of the audit log. So let's say if I click this, you can see that, yeah, this is the audit history. So this is a filtered version of the audit log where you can see changes happen and also who made the changes. You can see whatever the changes here. You can see the name by Fuller Kamara and the time, everything. So you can access this deleted transaction from the accountant tools. This is only available for the accountant users. So for the transaction journal, I have already shown you how to access the transaction journal. So you can either run the report, you can either run like the report, you go to the reporting and select and say journal. So this will show you all the journal entries. So you can see the debit and credit for each journal entry that you've made. You can see the debit and credit. You can see here the credit and also the debit. Then you can also access it when you are creating the entry. So now if you click more, then you can select the transaction journal. That is a quick way to access the transaction journal. That will help you see if there is anything that is out of order. Like for example, if you see an entry where you expect a debit to cash and a credit, so maybe account receivable, but the entry shows instead of a debit to cash, you see a debit to expense or a debit to something else, then you will know that the entry is not correct. That's a useful tool right there to be able to pick up some of the issues. Then we also have some tips on coaching the clients in terms of the workflow. You should try to help the clients with the terminologies used in QuickBooks Online. Your clients might find navigating QuickBooks Online easier if they understand what the different terms mean and what the various menus are for. For example, like for them to know the difference between a bill and an expense, then you should also help them get into the habit of using the right words and centers, like for the sales center in their hub for viewing and recording their invoices and payment for their customers. And also the expense center is for recording bills for products and services they purchase and their payments to the vendors. So for most of the small businesses, this will be all they need to know when starting out. You should try to keep it simple and help the client understand what they need to do for current complexity of their business, no more and no less. You should try to understand their business and encourage them to use the best practice workflow, but remind them that as their pro advisor, you are their go-to expert in QuickBooks Online. Then also you should keep checking in on the client, because if you keep checking in on them, then you can add value to your client relationship as you continue to touch base with clients regularly and identify new QuickBooks Online workflows that might be benefit to them as well. This way you can catch potential errors in time and coach your clients on best practices. That's the end of chapter 40. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video. Thank you.